Good evening, everyone. I want to say a few things about Beowulf as you start to read it. First of all, what language is it written in? What's the background here? Well, it's written in Old English, but not Old English as you might think if you think about like the King James Bible or the plays of Shakespeare. Those are actually not Old English. Those are modern English, but an early form of modern English. Old English, technically speaking, is the language of the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons were a group of Germanic tribes that came over to um, England, to Great Britain in the period after the fall of the Roman Empire, um, and they ended up taking over there and ruling it from the people that lived there before, it seems. So, and in fact, the name England is from Angle land, land of the Angles, Angles. And the Anglo Saxon kingdoms that developed in Britain um, warred with each other, fought with each other, traded with each other. But there was kind of eventually anyway, seven kingdoms in Anglo-Saxon England. And these kingdoms were characterized by a lot of, um, respect for warriors, that they also were eventually Christian kingdoms too. But they certainly fought each other and were it had developed from these Germanic tribes that it had war to be pretty important for them, and so somebody we don't know who writes the play Beowulf in this early Middle Ages period, and it's a very famous poem from the Anglo-Saxon language. Now, the setting of the poem, though, is not England. The setting of the poem is Scandinavia. Okay, much of it takes place in Denmark, the land of the Danes, uh, and the Danes are just north of Germany, in what we now call Denmark, and then Beowulf himself, um, the main character, not the one who's referred to right away in the beginning part of the book, but Beowulf, the Geat, Geat. Um, the Geats are from Sweden, what we now call Sweden, as well as some of the Swedes. And these different peoples fight each other, um, fight others as well. And so it is definitely a warlike time. And you'll see that quite a lot in the book. War oftentimes is fought for a couple reasons in this period. One, you've got the possibility of plunder. Okay, the plunder of wealth, the plunder of treasure, and then kings and others can build loyalty, can solidify their reputations as ring givers, as those who distribute the treasure. Okay, this is what we sometimes call a gift economy, where they are able to have loyalty because they distribute treasure. Those who receive the treasure are bound to them. People value these gold pieces, the jeweled swords, all sorts of things. And we'll take a look at a couple examples of those kind of things in class. Now, plunder is really important, and we'll see that even a dragon at the end of Beowulf has a huge hoard of wealth. Um, so if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, it's this poem influenced Tolkien. Tolkien was a scholar of Anglo-Saxon, okay, the language this is written in. You may remember in The Hobbit, the dragon on the huge pile of wealth, right, on the huge pile of jewelry. And so treasure hoards and wars and the gifts of wars, drinking in the mead halls and things like that, take place in Beowulf. Now, another reason for war or and violence in this world here in which Beowulf takes place is vengeance. Okay, and we should be familiar with this from the story of Odysseus. Um, Beowulf also lives in a world shaped by vengeance, and um, it's not only something that sort of comes to people, but it's also kind of expected that one will avenge another's blood, that you'll avenge those who have um, killed your family. And you'll see this throughout the book, the expectation and references to blood feuds and all sorts of things. Even the back and forth between Grendel and Beowulf, and the sort of tit for tat killing. So that's another part of it here, and that can make things very difficult because it's hard to end a blood feud, right? At some point, somebody has to say it's enough, but of course, there's a lot of emotional ties when you're talking about blood feuds as well. So those are some of the really important things that's going on here, and it's also the introduction points out that at the time that Beowulf comes to the Danes, because they're being terrorized by Grendel, this awful monster, the Danes and the Geats, Beowulf's people, are not on friendly terms, and so he's coming partially as an act of mercy. Okay, and the introduction points out by Ringler points out that Beowulf is really a remarkable person, and he's portrayed like this. He's not, as Ringler says, all brawn. He's got both courage and wisdom. Okay, certainly very courageous, very strong, not afraid too much of the terrible task that he has to accomplish, but also quite wise. And part of that is knowing how society works. Okay, there's a part where Beowulf looks ahead, knowing that there's going to be a wedding, and a woman is going to be given to her to the enemies of her father's people. And he says, this is going to end badly because the men at the wedding are going to be remembering that when they see that the people who are with the bride, they're going to see the swords that were plundered from their own relatives. And the old men are going to be spurring on the young men. Hey, listen, you've got to go out there and you've got to take vengeance. And the wedding itself is going to turn into, the wedding party itself is going to turn into a slaughter. And so Beowulf is someone who can see how things work. He can look at things. He can see that there's problems in the court of Rotgar, where he has been helping. And I'll try to point to something about that either in class or a bit later in the week. So Beowulf is someone who is quite wise as well as strong and courageous. Okay. Finally, one of the interesting things is that Beowulf takes place, as we said, in Scandinavia. Beowulf, if there was such a figure, would have been born right around 500 BC. And this is before the Scandinavian countries were Christianized. Okay. Yet the poet is writing in Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And so he can't really make Beowulf a Christian without maybe stretching things a bit too far. But he does make Beowulf and the Geats kind of monotheists, believers in one God, as opposed to pagans. And so he's able to kind of adapt them into something kind of recognizable for the audience. Okay. And well, you might not call Beowulf a Christian hero. He's someone who exhibits wisdom and character um, in a way that a warrior might have, the ideal warrior might have been able to do. All right. So those are some important things to keep in mind. We'll be talking about more about the poetry, about the story and everything in class this coming week.